If you ever feel out of control around food, you're not alone, and you're in the right place to learn practical, no-nonsense information about why you binge and how to stop. Binge eating does not mean that something is wrong with you. It's a natural but primitive brain response that you can correct. If you're ready for change, sign up for the Brain Over Binge self-paced online course for less than $20 per month. And if you feel you need personalized support, we also offer one-on-one coaching and group coaching. To learn more, go to brainoverbinge.com/subscribe. And I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the Brain Over Binge podcast, where you learn a simple, brain-based approach to ending binge eating. Hello, everyone. I know it's been a while, but I'm so happy to be back, and I hope that you've had a great start to the year. I mentioned in the most recent episode, which was in December, that this podcast would now be released on a less regular schedule, and I apologize it's taken me until February to get a new episode released. But I'm excited to report that I'll have 2 shows for you this week. The next show will be released in just a few days. Both today's episode and the next episode will feature a wonderful guest who's been on the show before. I'll be talking to Katherine Thomson, who's a medical sociologist and also a mentor to individuals with eating disorders. Katherine was on my show back in January of 2018, so just a little over a year ago, and I'm so glad to have her back, because I've heard some amazing feedback from the last time she was here. If you want to check out that prior episode with Katherine, it was episode 35, Fostering a Positive Mindset in Recovery, and I'll be sure to link to episode 35 in the show notes as well. I definitely encourage you to go back and listen to that episode because she had some amazing advice and insights to share. You can also learn more about Katherine and her background in that episode because we won't be going into that today. We're just going to dive into the topic. Before I bring Katherine on the show, I want to talk to you a little bit about the topics that we are going to discuss both today and in the next episode. I'm bringing Katherine on the show to talk about 2 topics that come up very frequently when people are dealing with binging. And those topics are food addiction and weight obsession. I find that both of these issues, if they're not addressed in some way, can make recovery much more difficult for people. So I hope that our discussions will help you navigate these issues so that you can keep moving forward toward a binge-free life. Katherine and I will talk about food addiction today and then weight obsession in the next show. In fact, I think they're probably the 2 most common topics that I get questions about. So I've been wanting to discuss these topics for a while. I thought it'd be great to have Katherine on the show to talk about these topics with me because she truly has some amazing information and ideas and experience when it comes to both of these issues. And I hope that this episode will be a great resource for you. And now it's time to get started with today's discussion about food addiction with Katherine Thomson. Thank you so much for being here again, Katherine.
Well, it's a pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation last year, and a lot of people contacted me as a result of that show. And it's great to be back.
Yeah, that conversation was so helpful to so many people, and that's why I was so glad to have you back on the show. And today we're going to be talking about food addiction and how this can affect recovery. Food addiction is really an issue that I feel like can hold people back from feeling confident with food. But I kind of want the listeners to understand up front that when I say that food addiction can hold people back in recovery, I don't mean that food addictions themselves are stopping a lot of people from ending binge eating, but instead it's often this idea of food addiction and the conflicting advice that's out there about food addiction and sort of the confusion surrounding whether or not to eat certain foods that can become a stumbling block to having freedom from an eating disorder. I feel like food addiction is a really complex topic and one that I know Katherine and I cannot possibly cover in one episode, but we really hope to give you a helpful perspective here today. I mean, science does not have all the answers on food addiction yet, and that's something I think is important for everyone listening to understand as they listen to this conversation. And there's a lot of contradicting research out there. There's so many different theories about how and why food addiction occurs. And there are a lot of researchers and experts and just everyday people who completely discredit the idea of food addiction altogether. So we aren't going to get too much into that debate here, but instead simply help you understand how food addiction or this idea of food addiction can affect recovery and how you can have a more helpful mindset surrounding this issue. So from my experience working with binge eaters, I find that there are some people who do believe that they are powerless against certain foods. They have this experience of being addicted to sugar or to carbohydrates or processed foods or many different types of foods. And often this leads to a cycle of restricting these foods or trying to restrict these foods altogether and then binging on them and really nothing in between. So, Katherine, I'd love it if you could talk about this and talk about how this experience of being addicted to a food or foods can affect recovery from binge eating.
Yes, this is such a big topic. And when I work with people, it's often one of the first things that comes up in our conversations, and specifically usually around sugar. People ask, should I give up sugar? Do I need to eat sugar? And people have a lot of, I find, guilt about their own relationship with things like sugars, refined carbohydrates. And I think a lot of that is coming from the discussions that we hear between these kind of, like you'd mentioned, these debates that are raging on about some eating disorder recovery professionals who say that food addiction does not exist and everybody needs to learn how to eat certain foods in moderation, and others who say actually that the whole crux of this is all about food addiction and anybody who's not giving it up is in denial. So we have these two extremes, and it does cause a lot of guilt and frustration. I guess one thing I want to say is that food addiction is not actually a diagnosis. So, bulimia, binge eating disorder, those are medical diagnoses. Food addiction is being talked about as though it is, but it doesn't actually exist in medical lexicon. However, I do think that there are some really compelling cases for saying that food addiction is real. And the more I started to look into this research, knowing I was going to come and be on your show, the more convinced I've become. Some people have very, very strong cravings for certain foods. They physiologically react to them in very extreme ways. And they even have similar symptoms to what someone might experience through withdrawal when they don't eat certain foods. And so there were 4 studies in particular, and I don't want to get too much into it, but just kind of wrapping this up before we talk about how this is relevant to recovery, that looked at populations of binge eaters and bulimics and found that a little bit more than half of those people also reported all the signs and symptoms that would be consistent with somebody having an addiction to usually sugar, some kind of carbohydrate. And so I think that's a good thing just to keep in mind as we go forward with this discussion, is that about half of people with binge eating disorder, and that's characterized by obsession, addiction, more along the lines of behavioral addiction, behavioral to binging, restricting, about half of those people do have some kind of an experience of food addiction, but about half do not. And so I think that's just really important to keep in mind, is that your experience is likely not the same as the other person you know with an eating disorder. So just kind of leading with that compassion and that perspective.
That's really interesting. And you wonder if, kind of the causal relationship there, is it something that preexists the binge eating? I don't know if you've looked a lot into that research, or is it something that develops along with the binge eating or as a result of the binge eating?
I think it's both. I mean, there are a lot of correlations between different kinds of digestive disorders and metabolic disorders and eating disorders. And so I do think that certain people have predispositions. They're just more sensitive to certain foods. I definitely think that is a big part of it. However, I think in order for for an addiction to really kind of take hold, there has to be some experience with eating something in large quantities. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. And I mean, my personal experience with this, this is partly why I'm so fascinated by it, because I can say that I was probably addicted to binging for about 10 to 12 years, but only about 3 of those years can I look back and say, yes, I was addicted to food for about 3 years. So I have a sense of the difference. I know these 2 different components of compulsive eating that are being discussed. The binge eating being a little bit more focusing on the obsession, the eating, whereas the food addiction is much more about this like really strong physical craving, and people report things like sweating, shaking, low blood sugar, and you can have one without the other. So some people actually have food addiction, but not the binge eating.
Yeah, definitely. Food addiction can be just normal amounts of food. It doesn't have to be these massive quantities that we talk about when we talk about binging. And I feel like from my personal experience, during the time that I was a binge eater, I did feel addicted to food, but it was more of the addiction to those massive quantities and not specifically it's really interesting to hear you distinguish that you felt addicted to binging for many years, but only addicted to food for a few years. So I think then thinking about myself, I was probably addicted to binging itself and these large quantities of typically sugar-laden foods, carbohydrate-laden foods. But then once the binging stopped, I didn't feel really that strong pull toward those foods. I mean, I still eat them, but I don't feel like I have that addiction to them. It went away with the cessation of the binge eating. So it is really interesting and something I think that anyone trying to recover from this has to navigate, because there is this divide in the eating disorder community. And a lot of people are saying you have to learn to eat everything in moderation, otherwise you're not recovered. Other people saying you can't eat certain foods in order to recover, because if you eat those foods, you're powerless and then you'll automatically binge. So for someone trying to recover, it's a really hard line to try to figure out. So what are your thoughts about this divide and how you think someone trying to recover can learn to successfully navigate it and decide whether or not they should be eating everything in moderation, or maybe if there's some foods that they'd be better off avoiding?
So it's tricky because the goal, of course, is to avoid obsession. The crux of binge eating disorder really is the obsession. I think you don't want to trigger that. And so whether you're talking about trying to avoid foods or gradually bring them in, there's always the risk that this is going to become sort of an obsessive project. There's going to be mental tension around it. I guess one thing I do want to say right off is that for your listeners, those people who are on a certain system, plan, program, and it's working for them, don't change it. I know that some eating disorder 12-step groups, for instance, have very strict abstinence guidelines. And if that's working, don't mess with it. What works for one person is not necessarily going to work for another. For other people, I would say look back on your own experience first. And have you ever cut something out before? And how has that worked? I know a lot of people, when they first start seeing me, the sugar thing comes up. And as we talk about it more, they kind of say, every time I've tried cutting that out before, it's resulted in a binge. And so if you can already go back on your experience and point to patterns like that, then I don't think you need to experiment with giving it up. If you've already done this and it kind of just breeds the obsession. However, if you haven't experimented, then it's definitely worth trying out. So if maybe you've never thought about categories of food or thought about how you'd feel without them. And in that case, I would say, try 4 days. Try 4 days in a row without eating a certain kind of food and see how you feel. And not just how you feel physically, but also your obsession. Does the obsessiveness get worse when you try and avoid or exclude a certain category of food? I mean, I think that most people that I work with do find that really processed, refined foods make the cravings worse. But you don't necessarily need to make them off limits. And I always try and encourage people to focus not so much on what you're not eating, but what you are eating. So instead of focusing on, I'm going to stay away from this and that macronutrient, so on and so forth, focus more on what you are choosing. At any given time, you have the option to choose something, and you can choose the foods that work for you.
Yeah, I love how you try to point the people you work with toward sort of determining what works best for their own body, because like you said, everyone is so different. And a lot of times I think people are looking for the experts to tell them what to do, or to hand them a diet plan, or to hand them what foods they should not be eating and what foods they should be eating. But it's really about discovering what works best for you. And, I think that for most people, like you said, to avoid the obsessions and to avoid that dieting mindset, it is most helpful, for my opinion, to learn to eat in the least restrictive way that you can. But for some people, that least restrictive way of eating includes possibly giving up certain foods. It can just be temporary. I mean, just because you decide to put a food aside right now because it's not working for you doesn't mean you'll never be able to eat that again. It doesn't mean you're powerless against it. It just means for right now, it's causing some sort of physiological reaction that's not helpful to you. So you're just going to put it aside. So yes, there are certain circumstances that certain people should avoid certain foods, but that doesn't mean everyone should. I really like how you have this balanced perspective and just trying to help people determine this for themselves and empowering them to figure this out for themselves.
Yes. Oh, and I really like what you mentioned. I just kind of want to reiterate it, is that what is true for you now might not be true for you in the future. I mean, there were times when I really thought that sugar would always be a problem for me. I thought I would always have sugar cravings. I would always have sort of a predisposition towards it. I can honestly say I have not had a sugar craving in, I don't even know how long, over 5, 6, 7 years. It's been it's completely not an issue for me. And I'm thankful that I didn't make it off limits, you know. And we change over time. I think a lot of it for me really was a physical readjustment. I think I had blood sugar instability for years, even following the eating disorder. But over time, I feel very, very balanced, and I'm able to eat pretty much what I want. I do notice still that, like, if I'm eating a lot of a certain kind of food several days in a row, that I start to kind of get off balance. And I think that's true for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And another thing for people to consider when you talk about these things being temporary is that I think dieting can make it a lot worse. I've seen research that if you're in that food deprived state and you are, starving yourself, trying to lose weight, that it does make you feel like you're addicted to food. It's kind of a natural survival instinct. And once you start nourishing yourself, once you start eating enough, I think a lot of that can rebalance. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's very true. When you're starved, you are seeking food, you're needing it, and you're also going to be more sensitive to the effects. So if you've been under eating for a period of time, or maybe haven't eaten in several hours, whatever you do eat is going to hit you harder. So I think that it does kind of create this increased sensitivity to certain foods, and it does perpetuate the whole cycle.
Definitely. And that kind of brings me to another question I wanted to ask you is that if someone wants to incorporate a food that they've been avoiding for a while back into their diet, back into how they're eating, how do you recommend someone go about doing this? You kind of mentioned maybe not to be too hungry as one thing, but what are some other ideas about reincorporating these type of foods?
So I do think for most people, it is a very important part of recovery. I think that I see people get a certain level of recovery and freedom around food, but it's not until people really feel safe and free and able to experiment with some of these foods they haven't let themselves have, that takes the recovery up to a whole new level. So it is an important thing for a lot of people to do. And my recommendation generally is that if somebody is in a state of early recovery, where they really haven't been able to go more than a week without binging, that it's probably best to just stick with safe foods and not really take on too many challenges, just try and keep things really, really simple. But once you can go a week or 2 weeks without binging, that's a really good time to start to experiment with bringing in different kinds of foods. And you want to do that in a very safe location. And for me, that was always outside of the house. I always felt much more in control and sane and dignified around food if I was outside of the house. In particular, I think if you can find a restaurant setting to experiment with some of these foods, that's ideal, because in a restaurant, you're seated, you're being served, you're using silverware. And unlike maybe going out and buying something at a grocery store or a bakery, in those situations, there's always kind of like that temptation to keep going, right? To keep buying the food or go next door and, start a binge, basically. So I think that restaurant settings are really great. The only problem with using a restaurant situation to experiment with some of these foods, whether it's a pasta or a sundae or what have you, is that the portion sizes are pretty big. So in that situation, I would say you can have half of your food put in a to-go container and then maybe just experiment eating the other half of it there, just to kind of have it off your plate. So you're only dealing with, a smaller portion of something at a time. And you don't have to take the rest of the food home with you. I always tell people, I know it feels bad right now, but it is okay to throw away food. And in the long term, you won't need to anymore.
That's a great idea, just to find a location that you feel safe about it. And, I would also add just to do it at a pace that feels comfortable for you. I know you would probably agree with this. You don't have to pressure yourself to, learn to eat every type of food in a week. Like, go at a pace that works for you.
Right, right. And I kind of am always interested to see with clients what foods they go for first, like which ones are easier for them than others. And I almost wish that people could see that of other people. I wish that people who are suffering right now could see what I see, because when you start to see the variety of which foods people fear, you start to realize there is no inherent property here of a food that makes one food a lot scarier than something else. Because some people, it's the starches that just freak them out. For others, it's the sweets. For others, it's about quantities of food. For others, it's finger foods. For some, it's, people who've gotten kind of into this whole low carb bandwagon. A lot of them are really scared of just juice. So what scares you is likely not the same thing that might scare somebody else. And that's just kind of good to keep in mind, and you can go at your own pace. One thing I would say is don't feel compelled to keep it in the house. It took me quite a while, maybe the first year from the last time I binged before I felt like I could have all foods in the house. And I just made that choice. I'm like, I'm not going to make this hard on myself. I'm just going to go easy and slow.
Yeah, definitely. And it's such an empowering feeling when you know that you can be around any type of food. You can eat any type of food if you so choose without it leading to a binge. And one thing I kind of want to mention, you talked about different people having different foods. And so it's not really the inherent properties of the food, but do you think it's more of their own beliefs about it or their own sort of conditioned patterns or thoughts about the foods rather than the actual foods themselves?
Yeah, that's interesting. I do think that there are certain foods that just are really stimulating. They produce a strong response, and usually those are the more processed foods and carbohydrates. So there is something to be said about certain foods are just more potent for people in general, regardless of whether or not you have some sort of an eating disorder. But I do think a lot of it comes down to people's beliefs. Like when people talk about what their safe foods are, sometimes I'm just amazed because they look nothing like what my safe foods were. And so I think that usually has to do with people's own dieting experiences. A lot of times people have this is successful, I'm kind of like my quotation mark hands are up right now, but successful diet, that they're always trying to go back to, this honeymoon diet experience that, that's when they got thin and it worked and it was the one diet that ever worked. And ever since then, they're chasing that diet high. And oftentimes the foods that people feel are safe are the foods that they were gravitating toward on that particular diet. And so that's why I'm seeing, like, more recently, you have a lot of people who it's the carbohydrates that they're very scared of. 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was more about the, fat. So I do think it has a lot to do with people's backgrounds and conditioning.
Yeah, it's probably a combination of both, the physiological reaction, which can be caused from the dieting itself, and then also, those thoughts and beliefs and what they've kind of learned about certain foods. And there is so much information out there about how foods are addictive. So I think this almost gets in people's minds, and not that it's not real. For anyone, binge eaters or non-binge eaters, it can be hard to stop eating a pleasurable food. I mean, I haven't binged in almost 14 years, I think, and sometimes you're eating a pleasurable food and you certainly want to keep eating it. Now, I realize that back when I was a binge eater, it was much more compelling. It was much more strong. So I'm not saying I'm dealing with the same thing now. No, not at all. But anyone, you watch kids, you watch people around pleasurable food, and it does cause that pleasure process in the brain. But I would also encourage you to realize that it does not mean you're powerless. Just because you have urges, just because you have cravings, just because you find a food pleasurable does not mean you're powerless over that food. And yes, setting it aside for a while or deciding what foods are best for you, that's all perfectly fine. But know that if you do have some and you do have that physiological reaction, you do have those urges that come up, you are not destined to follow them.
Yeah, and I think even just getting experience of, you'd asked me a little bit ago, and this kind of reminds me of what you just said of, what can people do if they're trying to kind of like get more freedom around food or take more risks. And I think getting comfortable with being able to put down food, halfway through a meal or eat half of something and just kind of put it down, even if it's not something that you think of as a trigger food or as a risky food. You can learn a lot from that experience. And you do see that kind of very natural human desire to not put the food down, to keep going. And it's like you said, kids do it, dogs, cats, you can watch. We eat to survive. We never could have made it as a species, any species, if we didn't have this very strong desire to eat. And so being able to kind of like look at that, accept that, but also kind of play with it a little bit, like putting down your food and waiting 10 minutes and then going back to it and not making it a big deal, just being kind of curious and just sort of like, oh, that's interesting. There's this real forward energy I feel right now, kind of like I'm being sucked into my plate. That's kind of funny. And even being able to kind of laugh about it because it's not that serious. It's just how our bodies work, our bodies and our minds.
That's really, really helpful. I know the listeners are going to benefit a lot from hearing that. And this has been such a great conversation. And as we kind of close out this talk on food addiction, do you have any final thoughts about this topic you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my hope is that your listeners will take from this conversation we've had today the take-home message of beware of anything that ignites obsession and beware of any kind of constriction in your thinking. If you're wanting to try something else out with food or experiment a little bit, if you start to feel tension in your mental attitude, back off. It's not that big a deal. You have time. You do not have to conquer everything right now. And ultimately, you're looking for freedom. And so if your path, whether it's, okay, I'm going to try and eat less of such and such food, or I'm going to start trying to incorporate this other kind of food, if that's causing you to feel doubtful of yourself or obsessed, then that's not the right attitude. That's not what we're trying to cultivate here. It's about freedom. It's about softness. It's about letting this kind of be, I think of it sometimes like a small whisper of an idea. This should not be commands and marching orders in your mind. It's just take it lightly and go at your own speed.
Wow, I love everything you've shared today. And I know the listeners will probably want to contact you or learn more about you. Can you let everyone know where you can do that?
Yeah. So my website is endbulimia, endbulimia.com. And there you can actually, I've a couple different links that you can click on, and it basically adds you to a list I have. And from there, I say 48 hours is the maximum time that it'll take me to get back with you.
Awesome. Well, Kathryn, I truly appreciate you sharing so much of your knowledge and your insights with the listeners today. And for those of you listening, I hope that this discussion has helped you view food addiction in a way that promotes recovery. Remember to check the show notes to learn more about Kathryn and also to sign up for the Brain Over Binge course if you want that extra guidance and extra structure while using the Brain Over Binge approach. Thank you again for joining us. And as I end today, I want to encourage you and remind you that you have the power to change your brain and live a binge-free life. The Brain Over Binge podcast is produced and recorded by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC. All work is copyrighted by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC, and all rights are reserved. As a disclaimer, the hosts of the Brain Over Binge podcast are not professional counselors or licensed healthcare providers, and this podcast is not a substitute for medical advice or any form of professional therapy. Eating disorders can have serious health consequences, and you are strongly advised to seek medical attention for matters relating to your health. Please get help when you need it, and good luck on your journey. Need more help? You can find all of our current and upcoming options for support at brainoverbinge.com.